Hello, so we continue with the community indifference curves and international trade. I'm your host, Elias. So in this unit, we want to look at the possibilities of autarky production and then trading with another nation based on what you have produced without specialization, and then compare it with what would happen if the nation is specialized. In other words, we want to define the gains from exchange and the gains from specialization. Okay, so let's begin our analysis. Consider nation 1, which is in autarky at point A, and remember I'll keep this same graph so that we are consistent with our analysis. And at point A, nation 1's terms of trade, domestic terms of trade, or the relative commodity prices, are equal to 1/4. And with that, we note that nation 1 then has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity X, because remember that this ratio is found, let's say PA, since we are looking at point A, is found by getting the ratio of the price of X divided by the price of Y. Okay, let me extend this. So price of Y. So if this ratio here is smaller, it means that then nation 1 here has a comparative advantage in producing commodity X and a comparative disadvantage in producing commodity Y. So with this autarky production, let's now assume that nation 1 wants to trade with nation 2, but it doesn't want to, the nation does not want to specialize in producing the commodity of its comparative advantage. In other words, nation 1 wants to continue producing at point A, but still trade with nation 2. If that be the case, then it means that we will have to refer to the world prices or world terms of trade, or the international terms of trade, which we've assumed so far to be equal to 1, because at the price of 1, the two nations will trade, and therefore they will be in equilibrium and maximize the welfare of the citizens. If nation 1 continues to produce at point A, but decides to exchange 20 units of X for 20 units of Y with nation 2, it means that nation 1 will now consume at point T. Now you will notice that at point T, the Y consumption levels have increased while the X consumption levels have reduced. This could be explained by many factors, which may include the people of nation 1 not developing good tests or strong tests for commodity X, but they are developing strong tests for commodity Y, and therefore they would want more of Y. So with that, then it means that the movement from point A to point T, which is the point of consumption after trade, becomes the gains, the exchange. It measures the gains from the exchange. So you will notice that what we've done here, we've drawn a line that is which has a slope of 1, which is the international terms of trade. And so we are moving from point A to point T and consume at a higher point where we are on indifference curve 2. Now, if we allow nation 1 to specialize in producing the commodity of its comparative advantage, it means that nation 1 then will move down the curve as the domestic terms of trade or the relative commodity price will be gravitating towards the international terms of trade of 1. So we'll be moving until we reach a world price of 1. That's when the nation will stop producing more of X. And this occurs at point B. And at point B, nation 1 ceases to have further comparative advantage in X, and nation 2 ceases to have further comparative advantage in Y. And by exchanging 60 units of X for 60 units of Y, nation 1 will then consume at point E. So note that at point E, nation 1 is consuming 70 of X, which means that from 130 to come and consume 70, nation 1 has exported 60 units of X. And nation 1 is consuming 80 units of Y, which means that with this then nation 2 is consuming, so you will notice that from 20 to 80, then nation 2 is importing 60 of Y. Now you will notice that from point A to point E, nation 1 has increased the consumption levels by 20 of X and 20 of Y, and this is similar to what we saw earlier. But note that again, if we compare the gains from exchange and the new consumption after specialization, we note that the movement then from T to point E will give us the gains from specialization, because the nation has specialized and therefore is consuming more. So then what we do is simply a decomposition, a direct one, where we just measure straight the gains for the nation for both production and specialization. Let's look at the tabular illustration. So let's start with the production gains with no specialization. That is where the nation has decided to continue producing the autarky units, but is willing to trade with another nation. So with that, we see that since there is no specialization, it means that the total gains to be shared between the two nations will be 0. Now, how do we get this 0? Let's look at the following. So in autarky, nation 1 is producing 50 of X and 60 of Y. Nation 2 is producing 80 of X and 80 of Y. With this, then, it shows that world production in autarky will be 130 of X and 100 of Y. If specialization is allowed, but nations decide not to specialize at all, but continue producing the autarky units, that is, if both nation 1 and nation 2 continue producing at their autarky points, it means that nation 1 then, when specialization is allowed, will still produce 50 of X and 60 of Y. And nation 2 will produce 80 of X and 40 of Y, such that the world production of X will be 130 and the world production of Y will be 100. To get the net gains, we subtract the specialization volumes. So the production when specialization is allowed, 50, minus the production in autarky before specialization was allowed. So we have 50 minus 50, which will give us 0. 60 minus 60 for Y, which will give us 0. And the same will happen for nation 2. And therefore, when we add, we will have the total gains of 0. So then it's these total gains of 0 which must be distributed between the two nations. Now we see that there is nothing to distribute, therefore even the gains in consumption will be affected, so the total gains will be 0. But let's see how the total gains can be decomposed. Okay, so with consumption, we note the following, that with trade, nation 1 consumes 30 units of X and 80 units of Y, while nation 2 consumes 100 units of X and 20 units of Y. So before trade was allowed, nation 1 consumed 50, that's the autarky amounts which were produced, and then 60 of Y, and nation 2 consumes 80 of X and 40 of Y. And world consumption, we noted that 130 will be consumed of X and 100 of Y, because what is produced domestically is what is consumed in the absence of trade. Now, when trade was allowed, so after the nations traded, that is by exchanging the commodities which they've produced, 30 units of X was consumed in nation 1 and 80 units of Y was consumed in nation 1. And if we are to measure the net gains, we subtract the consumption after trade of 30 minus the pre-trade consumption of 50, which will give us negative 20. And then we also subtract the 80 consumption after trade of Y minus 60 of Y before trade, and we get positive 20. And if we do the same for nation 2, 100 of x minus 80, we get 20, and 20 minus 40, we get negative 20. And if we add these two, we see that we end up with 0 gains of x and 0 gains of y, which shows that when two nations are not specializing in producing the commodities of their comparative advantage, it means that the gains will be 0. So all they've done is just reallocated whatever was available, but gained nothing. So let's look at what will happen if the nations now specialized. So production gains with specialization. So this is what we noted earlier on, that with the specialization, the nation will gain, the world will gain 40 of x and 40 of y. And we looked at this table when we just started looking at the gains from specialization and from trade. So when the nations now are specializing, the production of x increases to 130 in nation 1, and the y reduces to 20 in nation 1, because y is a commodity of comparative disadvantage in nation 1. Nation 2 will also produce more of y and less of x, and we see that world production increases to 170 for x from 130 and 140 for y from 100. And therefore, when we subtract the after specialization production of 170 for x minus 130, we get 40, and 140 of y minus 100, we get 40. And it is these amounts, then these gains, that must be distributed between nation 1 and nation 2. And in our previous analysis, we noted that nation 1 will gain 20 of x and 20 of y, and even nation 2 will gain 20 of x and 20 of y. But let's show this so that we are clear with what we are doing. So the consumption gains then, so with trade after specialization, nation 1 consumes 70 units of x and 80 units of y, while nation 2 consumes 100 units of x and 60 units of y. And in a tabular illustration, we see that subtracting the after-trade consumption minus the pre-trade consumption, nation 1 gains 20 of x and 80 of y after trade minus 60 of y before trade. We see that nation 1 gains 20 of y. And therefore, if we do the same for nation 2, we notice that by adding them, the world gains 40 of x and 40 of y. This should be noted that the bottom line, the last column here, the world column, must be equal for both the consumption and the production, because what is produced must be consumed. So if you have after trade, after specialization, you have 170 produced of x, meaning even after consumption, you should have 170 of x consumed in the world. But however, what would differ will be the distribution here. So the last column here, which are the totals, must be equal, because whatever is produced must be consumed. So even what is gained must be distributed in consumption. Okay, so now with increasing costs, let's look at the small country case. So where now we just want to focus on a small country that cannot affect the relative commodity prices. So with increasing cost, a small nation does not completely specialize in the production of commodity X or commodity Y, depending on the commodity of its comparative advantage. Now this is because the nation will be incurring more and more cost if it tries to completely specialize. So if we assume that nation 1 is a small country while nation 2 is a large country, then it means that nation 1 is in autarky at point A. Now with the opening of trade, if a trade is allowed, at this relative commodity price of 1/4 in nation 1, which is smaller than the world relative commodity price of 1, which means that nation 1 then has a comparative advantage in producing commodity X. So despite it being a small nation, it can produce commodity X at a lower cost. Therefore, it has a comparative advantage in producing commodity X. And with that, Nation 1 will specialize in the production of commodity X, and the relative commodity prices will be gravitating towards the world prices, which is equal to 1. So when the world prices are equal for Nation 1 and that of the world, Nation 1 will stop producing more of X, and it will produce at that point, which is point B. And by exchanging 60 units of X for 60 units of Y, Nation 1 will consume at point E, where it's exporting 60 to the world and then importing 60 of Y. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the last session, which will be session number 8. If you have questions, please send an email to muauelias@gmail.com. Bye-bye.